Welcome to the Driving Change podcast on the Evergreen Podcast Network, where we live at the intersection of neuroscience and storytelling. If you love great stories and you love understanding the mindset it takes to be a world-class change agent, then join us as our fascinating guests from all walks of life unpack their unique journeys of perseverance and passion, of expertise and experience, and be inspired to use your own story to drive change. Hey everybody, welcome back to another episode of the Driving Change Show. I'm your host, Jeff Bloomfield, and today our episode's a special one because we get to welcome back a friend of the show, someone whose last appearance had a whole lot of you reaching out saying, hey, that guy kind of changed the way I think. Well, buckle up because today he's back, and this time he's bringing even more mind-expanding insight. Now, I'm just going to go ahead and give it away. It's Dr. Angus Fletcher. And Angus is not just somebody that I look up to as a thought leader. He's also a fellow Buckeye, but more importantly, he's a neuroscientist who truly understands what it means to use the brain from a storytelling perspective. But I think we're going to bring a couple little different elements of insight this time that you hadn't considered. And he's got a new book coming out that I'm excited about. Now, before we jump in, quick thanks to the season sponsor this year of Brain Trust. If you ever found yourself searching for a better way to communicate, whether you're in sales or leadership or coaching or heck, just parenting, go over and check them out, braintrustgrowth.com to learn more. Now, today, I want you to ask yourself this question as you're listening. Like, what if I told you that some of your smartest decisions, the ones that maybe shaped your life or your business or your relationships, weren't actually made by your rational brain at all? They actually came from something deeper, maybe something older, something primal. Well, Dr. Fletcher, as I mentioned, neuroscientist, storyteller, professor of literature at Ohio State, he's going to help us unlock these secrets behind what he's calling now Primal Intelligence. Now, this is going to be amazing. Last time we really unpacked his book, Wonderworks. That one blew our mind. But now with Primal Intelligence, we're going to go a little bit deeper into why humans do what they do, how we think. And what I love about it is how our brain has this ability from intuition, imagination, common sense, and emotion. It's deeply embedded in us, but we haven't really understood it to the extent that folks like Dr. Fletcher have been studying it. And they're going to give us insights into how we can become better decision makers, heck, better humans in general. Angus, it's an honor to have you back on the show. Can't wait to dive deeply into your latest work.
I mean, it's an honor to be here, Jeff, and thank you for that extraordinary introduction.
Now, you've been working a lot with the military lately. They've had a lot of your time. Over time, you've done a lot with just in general special operations. You work with DARPA, Fortune 50 companies, education reform. I mean, you're on the front lines of a lot of this, but your expertise, I would say, is that you understand the neuroscience of communication relative to the story brain better than anybody on the planet. Now, would you refute that assertion?
Well, I would say that I'm part of a team here at Ohio State's Project Narrative that is the world leader in understanding how narrative works in the brain. And I'm the one who agrees to go on podcasts, so I get all the celebrity and all the fame. But it's important to remember that, we have a whole group of researchers here, a huge team of people working in the basement, studying brains, running the scanners, and I'm just the kind of pretty face out front.
Shout out to all of the Dr. Angus Fletcher teammates who are doing a lot of the grunt work behind the scenes to map the brain and put out a lot of this research. So in your new book, Primal Intelligence, we're going to jump right out of it. We're going to jump right into it. I don't even care about your origin story. If you want to know Dr. Fletcher's origin story, go back and listen to the last episode. We talked about it there. I want to get right into this today. So I love this comment, like humans are not rational creatures who sometimes feel, we're emotional creatures who sometimes think.
Yeah.
How does that reframe really everything we've been taught about intelligence?
So emotion is how we know ourselves. Emotion evolved in the brain. It's the most ancient form of intelligence. It's over 500 million years. It's the basis of your fight or flight response. So fear and anger, when those come up in your brain, that's the most ancient part of your brain. And what that's telling you is danger. And when you hear danger, your choices are run away or figure out how to win. And a huge part of our intelligence is both making the decision about whether to run or to fight. And then when we decide to fight, how we win. So all that comes out of emotion. And all of that is driven by this ancient part of our brain, which goes all the way back to when we were lizards.
So I think most people at this point have been exposed to, fight or flight most people could tell you they've even heard of the amygdala because there's been so much in pop culture around a lot of it. But what you did in this work, I think, and I'd love to have you explain a little bit about, you started to break things into the primal brain systems and in what that means and what the different brain systems are and what's really underdeveloped in modern society and what's the cost of that underdevelopment. Help us understand a little bit about some of that work and what it means to us.
So this work all came out of work with U.S. Army Special Operations. And to your point, it did start with this threat response with the amygdala trigger. And the reason it started there is because I'm not a special operator, but I work a lot in schools. And what we notice in schools is the two main problems that kids have is anxiety, which is a fear response, or stress and anger. So kids today are constantly having fight or flight responses in school. And you see this too with most people at work. They're constantly feeling stress flooding their system, and that stress is shifting them into these short-term behaviors, which are inhibiting their long-term growth and their ability to succeed and to thrive. And the reason this is significant is that our society's response to when they hear that someone is experiencing a threat is to say, let's remove the threat. So that's why we create safe spaces. That's why we promote things, like meditation and mindfulness. And that's okay, except for the problem is that your brain doesn't want to escape the threat. Your brain actually wants to know how to deal with the threat, how to defeat the threat, how to win. And the way that you win against the threat is you're able to make a plan. You come up with a plan for dealing with the threat. And so the reason I started working with special operators is you can go into a room with them and pull out a grenade. They don't panic. They don't care. No fight or flight response, no anger, no anxiety. Why? Because they're able to make a plan immediately. You can pull the pin off the grenade. Still, none of those fight or flight responses. Why? Because they can make a plan immediately. You can roll the grenade across the room towards them. No concern. And these are individuals who spend their life surrounded by things that we would all consider incredible threats, yet they don't have those fight or flight responses because they're able to make plans so fast. And so the starting point of the research was, what is their brain doing that's allowing them to make effective plans so fast? Because if you can teach that to kids, they will never feel anxious or angry again. If you can teach that to adults, they'll never feel anxious or angry again. And so to your point, what we did is we broke that down into these kind of 4 primal brain powers, and we kind of walk through what each of them is and how each of them works.
So this is fascinating to me, and I know what it starts to get into like the programming and the rewiring and all that fun stuff. And I know you're doing an event coming up in Columbus with James Clear, author of Atomic Habits. And I think these two, I know why you're doing it, right? This is a great combination. If you recall in our first episode, so I'm a son of a Marine, grandson of an Army medic from World War II. So the military is kind of in my genes, so to speak. And I know that under pressure, under stress, humans tend to show up at their highest level of programming, which is at an unconscious, habitual, including communication, which we'll get to in a little bit. What did you find there with the special operations folks as far as how they were able to, because that's not something you show up at boot camp, your first day in the Army, and you have that, right? It's got to be, I hate to almost use the word program, but really that's the right word. It's got to be programmed into your unconscious to be able to react under pressure like that. What have you learned about that?
Yeah, they have to learn how to do it. And they have this incredible, they're called the cadre, the special forces cadre, who have gone through combat themselves and who have come back and have sort of figured out how to train these things. So the first thing that we do is we teach them to not run away from their fight or flight response. We teach them that your emotions are telling you something. And so the most basic thing that your emotions are telling you is if you're scared, if you're feeling afraid, that's because you have no plan. If you're feeling angry, that's because you have one plan and you feel like you have to make that plan work. And so the first thing is to start to understand, okay, my emotions are telling me how many plans that I have. And really the brain does best when it has 2, sometimes 3 plans. So if you have no plans, what you want to do is you want to say to yourself, okay, what I want to do is I want to make what's called a first step plan. What's the simplest thing I can do now just to get myself moving? And so in combat, we see this a lot with soldiers. They freeze in combat because they forget the plan. And we train them to focus their eyes on a long-term objective. And that allows them to make a first step plan and start walking, and then other things happen. And so if you're feeling scared, the thing to do is remember, what's your primary objective? Start to walk towards that. If you're feeling angry, remember, there are other paths up the mountain. Take a step back. What's another way? Maybe you have to change your communication. A lot of anger, particularly in a business context, comes from failed communication because what you're saying is not explain to the other person what they need to do. And so you just keep yelling it louder, right? And then you get stressed and angry. So we start with that. And then we start with other things, like you talked about. Intuition is your ability to spot opportunities. The more your brain is spotting opportunities, the more that it's feeling powerful in the space because it's saying, oh, I can do all of these things. So rather than just reacting to problems, I'm seeing what I can do to win. Imagination is your ability to make plans faster, and common sense is your ability to choose the smart plan at the right time. A lot of times people get overwhelmed because they make a lot of plans. They don't know which plan to do. And if you have common sense, you're like, this is the right plan now. I'll just take this. I'll take the easy gain. So that's the kind of overview of the kind of basic stuff we do.
So you literally just sold, a couple thousand books just with that last answer, because if that's in the book, I want it right now. Like I want to know more about that. Let me clarify a couple things there, because you said a couple things that really sparked a thought in my mind. So if in any given situation, if we're feeling anxious, it's because we don't have a plan. If we're feeling fearful, it's because maybe I'm getting this wrong. I might have heard you wrong. We only have one plan.
If you're fearful, it's because you've got no plan.
No plan. Anxious is
angry. It's one plan. Angry. It's one plan.
Okay.
So if you ever see people so this happens sometimes with bosses, that their temperature will start to rise and they'll start yelling at the people around them, right?
Yeah.
And that's because in the boss's mind, this has to happen this way and people aren't doing it. And we see this a lot. Now, sometimes that anger is appropriate. And you have to ask, why did your brain evolve anger when it only has one plan? The answer is that one plan can work. And a plan acted assertively is more likely to work than a plan acted tentatively. So your brain is going into this primal response because it's saying, if I've only got one plan, I better do it hard. And so if you're in a life or death situation, which we see in combat, or if you're an ER surgeon or something like that, sometimes anger can be appropriate. 99% of the time, however, in most peacetime situations, that's a signal to you to back off and say to yourself, okay, is there another way? So that I can calm myself down, start to see other options. And so that's the main overview that we teach people.
And so I think, we've always studied this, and I believe you probably could back it up with fMRI studies and blood tests and the physiology side, is when I'm under duress and under pressure, if I have too high of a level of cortisol and or adrenaline flowing, and I don't have the plan in my mind mapped out, I actually lose imagination. I lose creative thinking. I shut down the parts of the brain that allows me to step back and look at that picture. Is that accurate?
That's completely accurate. And that's why we say to people, so the simple analogy we always use to go back to soldiers on the battlefield, because this is a thing that will happen to almost anyone on the battlefield. It's the first time they're in combat, no matter how trained they are, they experience extreme panic. And they get what's inside what we call the fear box. And that's another word for tunnel vision. So basically you start seeing a few inches in front of you and your gaze narrows. And how do you get out of that? Well, what we know is that you get out of that when your sergeant comes over and taps you on the shoulder and says, look 200 yards ahead. Look to the future. And so we know the same thing when people start to get angry or stressed in a work environment. We say, what is your long-term objective here? Remember, your long-term objective here is to help this team accomplish this task, Or if you're a parent getting angry at your kids, remember, what is your long-term objective here? Is your long-term objective to get them to school? Are you getting angry because you thought you were going to have a fun day and the kids are fighting in the back seat? Remember, your objective is to have a good time. Focus on that objective. That'll calm you down. To your point, it'll allow the cortisol and everything else to kind of rebalance. And then you can start to be more creative in those situations. And it all comes down to having that clarity about your overall long-term goal. So a lot of times we work with people and we coach them and say, if you can't find that in the moment, let's find it ahead of time. So that before you get into a stressful situation, you can recall it immediately.
Which is training, right? That's what we do with training and putting people in those situations.
Yes.
Wow, now you just created a cottage industry. Now you're gonna have to have primal parenting, you're gonna have to have all these now other books spun out that just teach you how to do these in these situations. This is fascinating to me. The question then becomes, from my mind, how much of our earlier development, whether it be good or bad, could be traumatic, could not be traumatic, that did some hardwiring from a programmatic standpoint into our unconscious, affects negatively our ability to, in that moment, manage and regulate those emotions?
So, yeah, I mean, the first thing I always want to say to people is whatever happened to you in your childhood, you can grow from that and you can develop from that. So I don't want to be pessimistic or fatalistic about it. But I do want to say to parents and to school systems that you can really help kids at a young age get better at this stuff. And the problem that a lot of our kids are facing now is, first of all, a lot of them use too much technology. And because they're using too much technology, they're in this frictionless environment the whole time where they're not learning how to deal with hard things that challenge them in a kind of productive, slow way. A lot of them are also in classrooms where they're told there are right or wrong answers. And the challenge of life is that there are actually not right or wrong answers, that's why you need leaders, is to be able to figure out, okay, I think this answer is better, but there's a lot of unknown here. There's a lot of gray here. Like, I'm doing my best and kind of figuring it out as we go along. And so as a young person, what we want to do is we want to put you in environments where you feel comfortable making hard decisions, where you feel comfortable failing, and where we don't intervene as adults and give you the right answer the whole time, but we allow you to kind of stay in that state of discomfort, because it's really important as a young person to be able to start to both handle discomfort and then also learn to self-assess. So that instead of looking to adults for guidance, you're saying, okay, do I feel like I'm doing this myself adequately? So your point is completely correct that we could be doing a lot more to help kids, and that actually right now our society is doing the opposite and probably making it more challenging for young people.
Yeah, and we have a culture full of people, right, that that as adults haven't recognized what's driving a lot of their reactive nature.
Yeah. Yeah. And we have a lot of people who don't have purpose. So, like I was saying earlier about how you've got to be able to find that point on the horizon. One of the things that happens when you work with people in the Army and the military and special operations is, more so than average people, they figured out what their purpose is. They figured out what their mission is. And as a person, it is really important to have a mission-driven life where you say, this is why I'm here. And that doesn't mean that I think that everyone has to live for my mission. I don't, but it's important for me to have clarity about that. And it's important for me to encourage young people to find their mission, and for that mission not to be too externally driven. If that mission is, fame or Instagram hits or something like that, that's out of your control.
Right.
Whereas, if your mission is, I want to teach people things, I want to empower people, I want to research the brain, these kinds of things, I want to stand up for people. These are things that you can do. These are things that can be your mission. That produces clarity, and that allows you to self-assess more accurately and to kind of, grow your brain more intentionally.
Yeah, I think why you and I have always clicked and connected on this is, like, our mission around here is we want to help improve relationships by helping teach people how to communicate more effectively by understanding what's going on between their ears. Because if you can identify what's happening between the ears, then I love what you said earlier. You can start to create scenarios where I can put myself, when I'm not stressed out and reactive, and how will I respond when these moments arise? And then I can start to reprogram my unconscious to be better at my unconscious behaviors, right, when they happen. Storytelling is what you kind of are known for in the storytelling lab and all the things you've done there. But what I also have always connected with you on is storytelling in today's culture has almost become so cliche. There's all these storytelling gurus running around. And whenever I ask somebody, hey, explain to me the intricate details of the neuroscience relative to storytelling, I get a lot of cross eyes. Like, I don't know what you mean. Like, you're like one of the only guys I can talk to about this from a neuroscience standpoint that gets it. But what I love about your take on storytelling is that storytelling isn't just once upon a time there was a guy and he had a problem and he overcame the problem and now his life's great. Storytelling is a way of thinking. It's a way of imagining. It's a way of problem solving. It's the way that our brain actually fundamentally processes the world around it. And I want to start with imagination. You call imagination a thinking tool. Not just some like creative indulgence. So that boy just has a big imagination. Like he's going to end up being like an artist or a songwriter or whatever. No, imagination is so hardwired into the primal mammalian part of our brain as a creative and as a thinking tool, not just as a creative tool. Tell us a little bit more about what you've learned there and how we use it and how we can use it better.
So one thing that is not me, but is maybe your audience doesn't know, is that there's this thing in the brain called the default mode network. And this is what goes active whenever our brain is not consciously focused on a task. And the reason it was discovered is a bunch of brain scientists, when they invented the first brain scanner, put people in the brain scanner and they told them to stop thinking. They said, stop thinking. And so the people stopped thinking, and then immediately this huge part of the brain went active. And the scientists got very irritated and were like, no, we told you to stop thinking. And the more they stopped thinking, the more this part of the brain went active. And what scientists realized is that this part of the brain goes active when we're not focused on work. And the reason that part of the brain goes active is because it's able to look into the future. It's our imagination, and it's constantly doing this thing called mind wandering, where it's saying, well, what could I do better? Instead of, now that I'm not focused on just pure survival, what could I do in the long term to make my life better? What tools could I invent? What teams could I form? What ways could I better myself? And so that's the default mode network. That's our imagination, essentially. That's what goes active in children when they're playing. As adults, we don't use it very much because the moment we're not working, we go on our phone or we start watching TV or something, and we're not activating our imagination. And so one of the main basic pieces of advice is if you're not doing something, just sit for a few moments and let your mind wander. And it will start to bring up things. And if it brings up negative things, those are things it wants you to deal with. And if it's bringing up positive things, chase those positive things. Another thing we work on a lot is something that we call counterfactual thinking.
Okay.
And counterfactual thinking is just a fancy word, a science word for going, what if? What if I did this? What if I did that? And the way you do counterfactual thinking effectively is you say, what's the smallest change I can make now that will have the biggest impact in the future? And so you look around constantly, whether it's your organization, whether it's yourself, and you ask, okay, what little thing could I do? Now let me imagine the effect of that in 5 minutes, in an hour, in 5 days, in a year. And the more your brain practices that process, which is imagination, which is a counterfactual, the more it starts to see all these possibilities. And over time, the more you do that, the more you'll start to realize some of those possibilities are right for you. And your brain will hold on to them. It will anchor that as a plan, and you'll find yourself walking that new path of growth. So those are a couple of simple things we do. We do that with kids. We do that with special operators. We do that with businesses. But these are natural processes that your brain is doing all the time. And to your point, a lot of it just comes down to letting your brain do this deep work that it wants to do, tap into this huge strength that nature has given you, and spend a little bit less time distracting yourself on your phone.
I love the idea of, and our team around here knows, I call the shower my thinkalator, because all my best ideas come in the shower. I built an entire company, 2 companies off of just ideas out of the shower. I tell people I just need a whiteboard in the shower. And for others, it might be taking a walk. It might be sitting at the beach. There's these places that you go that turn off that the task positive part of the brain and allow you to explore those areas. But the counter to that is, if I'm not mistaken, I can't activate that part of the brain very well if I'm in complete panic or stress or fight or flight or complete task positive all the time. It doesn't activate, correct?
That's right. And that's why the first step of all this stuff, so you're obviously good at making plans. That's how you were able to build 2 businesses. And so you have a core confidence in your ability if something goes wrong for you to be able to figure out a fix. You also have a core confidence in your ability to take a new opportunity and grow it. A lot of people, when they have a new idea, they actually back away from it because they say, you know what, I can't do that. That's too stressful, So it all starts, to your point, with that core competence in planning, which allows you to manage your threat response. Once you have that, putting yourself in the shower or in nature or listening to classical music, people do all sorts of kinds of things that allows mind wandering. That then gives your brain the space to have those big ideas that you can connect with your planning brain to start to create and innovate your future.
And I think you're so right. And now the younger generation, because they're so stimulated by the screens, they're not activating that part of the brain. And I wonder sometimes, I worry, in the brain development, are we not creating the neural pathways there as reticent as maybe you and I did growing up? Is that a concern that you have? Is that part of it's brain development? Part of it, I don't want to overstate that. Well, no, the brain's eventually going to get there. It's going to develop the way it's going to develop. But I also know, because of neuroplasticity, that we are in charge of what gets developed in our brains too, right? So what's that balance between being, to your point, fatalistic about the Gen Alpha and Gen Zs? They're not going to be imaginative at all because all they do is stimulate themselves in the wrong part of the brain.
Yeah, I think we're right to be concerned. I think, this is an ongoing debate, and I'm a little bit more on the side of you're not damaging your brain with technology, but you're not exercising your brain with technology. And what I mean by that is if you're just sitting on the couch all day, you're not damaging your muscles, but you're not exercising your muscles.
Right.
And if you need to use those muscles, they're not going to be there. And so what we're having with this generation is they're not strengthening their brain. And then as a result, when they get into challenging situations, they run away from them or they get anxious. Or a lot of them they want to go back to school or spend all their time in school as opposed to going out and kind of starting companies or going into the workforce or living their dreams. And what we really need to do is we really need to start figuring out ways to help people strengthen those neural pathways, exactly as you're talking about, at a young age by helping them see that they can make plans. So one of the things that I often say is if you want to help a young person, congratulate them when they make a smart plan that you would not have made. So a big problem that we have when we're mentoring young people is we say, you know what, you could do it better this way, right? You know, you could do it better, or I would do this, right? Or that's wrong, you know? And as a result, they become dependent on adults. And they say, oh, you know, whereas, you know, if your kid comes up with something and you're like, you know what, that's kind of odd, but yeah, I think it actually might work, you know, or, you know, I wouldn't have done it that way, but let's see, you know, then they start to develop those neural pathways. And this is so key when we're training young soldiers. It's the same way is, you know, when you're on a battlefield, there's not a right answer, you know, and the moment
don't die,
don't die, right? You know, or don't get your team killed, right? You know, but the reality is, you know, no one knows for sure. But if you start to get tentative on a battlefield, you're toast. It's over.
Right.
So you have to maintain initiative. That's the only thing we know. And maintaining initiative comes from enacting imperfect plans aggressively. I mean, that's how you develop it, you know. There's a famous saying by General Patton that, you know, a good plan acted with violence today is better than a perfect plan tomorrow. And that's really true on the battlefield is you want good enough plans that you act assertively. And it's the same thing with kids is don't keep trying to make their lives perfect. Don't be like, you know what? You know, because, you know, my kids are always doing cooking. I don't know if you've ever had this thing with, you know, your kids trying to cook in your kitchen or whatever, you know, and you're always like, oh, no, cook the egg this way. No, just let them do it okay, because they're learning and developing these parts of the brain you can't see. And it's the same thing with your employees. It's the same thing with anyone. Is don't become perfectionists too fast, especially with young people when they're developing these pathways. Once they've got them developed, you can start to put pressure on them, you know, and then they can start to respond and then they can start to optimize. But in that crucial growth phase, you know, have tolerance for imperfect things that are nevertheless adequate.
Wow, that's such a great, as you said it there, but from a leadership standpoint, it makes perfect sense from a parenting standpoint. We probably all suck at that because we're all control freaks, and we try to make our, you know, in the spirit of protecting our children from making mistakes, we over control, and then they don't develop that part of their brain. But in the workforce, it really struck me as you were saying that, you know, and from a leadership standpoint, how often do we, because we've done something a certain way and we've got a certain set of results that we can predict that we don't allow for them to be any other way. So we step in and in the spirit of expediency, right? And tell people what they should do and how they do it. And next thing you know, we have a culture of people that just want to fall in line and be told what to do versus having some type of intuition and where they're creative now and imaginative and come up with things you would have never come up with before. And that's a primal reaction, right? It's, you prime that in your own brain as a leader, and then the result is you communicate that way. And you think that you're getting efficiency, you think you're getting better results, but you're minimizing all this world of possibility.
That's so brilliant. And that is exactly 100% what I believe. And so what happens is as a leader, you become successful, and then you turn everyone around you into managers.
Yeah.
And those managers are managing the plan that you have created, which is fine so long as the environment doesn't change, right? Because I mean, if your plan is working, then you want a lot of managers who are optimizing the plan and making it more productive and more efficient. The problem is that in business, you're in a competitive environment, just like you are in the military. And so your environment is constantly breaking your best ideas and your best products because someone else is taking them, you know, or someone else is doing something else. So the market is shifting and demands are shifting. And so actually, at the same time as you're coaching managers, you also need to coach leaders. And leaders need to be people who try things that don't work the first time, but then keep pushing on it. We often talk about this, that new ideas, when they first emerge, are half-formed. New ideas are always half-formed. And what that means is that people think that they are deformed. Right? Because you come up with this new idea and you're like, that's kind of weird, you know? And then what people do is they're like, you know, let's get rid of all the weird stuff. And then when you get rid of all the weird stuff, you get rid of all the new stuff. And so actually you need a whole group of people on your team who are making new ideas, who are realizing this doesn't work, but it has potential. Let's double down on the weird stuff and let's push that stuff forward. And the more you're doing that, the more you're preparing for the future that you can't see. There's a great general, I'm sure you know him in your family, Dwight Eisenhower, used to be a US president. And, you know, one of his whole things was you got to train planners. And the way you train planners is you make plans. So you're constantly making plans. But the moment that events shift, you have to throw out all those plans and just rely on the planner. And realize that the purpose of making plans isn't to make the plan, it's to make the planner. And it's the same thing with your team. If you never allow them to make their own plans, if you never allow them to have new ideas that they then try and take across the finish line, if they never have practice in that, then when you need them to do it, they will be incompetent. Because all they know is how to follow. And they'll just look to you. And the moment you don't have an idea that saves your company, it's over.
Wow. I mean, we could pause there for a second. I got a couple of things I want to double underline in Sharpie. The purpose of teaching people how to make plans isn't to teach them how to make plans. It's to actually teach them how to be a planner.
Yeah. So
Or isn't it isn't the purpose of the plan being perfect. It's about teaching them how to make plans. However you said that. We're going to have to go back and rewind the tape on that because it was brilliant.
no. Yeah, no, you're saying it exactly right, right? The purpose of planning isn't to develop the plan. It's to develop the planner.
Love it.
And what happens is people get stuck on the plan.
Yeah.
And they think, oh, I got to do this. It's no, you because you made that plan yesterday, you can make a plan today. Focus on making a new plan because you learned how to make a plan based on the plan you made yesterday. Focus on the skill, not on the product.
The other thing you said is maybe it should be a chapter in an upcoming book that you're going to write if it's not in this one is double down on the weird stuff. Like I love that. Double down on the weird stuff. That's brilliant. Because you're right, we throw some stuff out there. And I think as leaders, sometimes we get self-conscious, right? We think, well, if I bring a half-baked plan with a little bit of weird stuff in it, and it doesn't, I know as somebody who's willing to try 10 new ideas out that 8 of them are going to be terrible. But if my team starts to look at, man, 8 ideas of everything Jeff brings at the time is terrible, but man, 2 of them are genius. As a leader, you can start to get self-conscious and then you stop actually putting those half-baked plans out there because you're afraid people will think maybe you don't know how to create a fully baked idea, right?
Yeah, but you do. And the thing is just look at any successful person, whether it's Steve Jobs, whether it's Albert Einstein, in any field that you want to look at, whether it's Van Gogh, they had a ton of terrible ideas, but the ideas that they had weren't just good, they were revolutionary.
Yeah.
And that's really where it is with leaders. It doesn't matter if 8 or even 9 of your 10 ideas are terrible. If that one other idea transforms the business and gives you, revenue for 15, 20 years, of course not,
Right.
And that's what you have to start shifting yourself into that mindset of the big win and taking the risk that has the huge reward.
And I think that's so important in life in general is if you don't plan for the 10 ideas and you think the first idea is all you're ever going to come up with, how many times, talk to anybody, right? How many times when you have 10 ideas, was it the first one that was the best one? It's usually never. It's usually somewhere it's like number 7 or 8 or 10 that end up being the best idea.
Yeah.
So if you don't take a shot at those 10 ideas, you would have never gotten to the right one.
No, it's your point about, being in the shower or whatever. A lot of times what will happen is you'll have this idea and you'll pitch it to everyone and they'll be like, that was a terrible idea.
Yeah.
And then 3 days later, you'll be in the shower and you'll be like, this is actually the way to take that idea and make it work. And so you've got to get the ideas moving in your head and realize that they take time to gestate. I mean, they are like a child, imagine if after, your kid was born, you're like, you're not even in college yet. You're useless. What's wrong with you?
You're terrible.
Right. Yeah. The brain, it takes time. It takes time to grow. And you can't just assume that everything's going to be there perfect, but you're never going to get it there, to the end point if you don't start it early, have tolerance for its imperfections.
Yeah, that's another great point. And the way that neurons fire and wire together, if you don't start the process of firing and wiring, they won't continue, right? So until you get that, that's such a good idea, such a good point, rather. One of the things that you're, and this idea it's all wrapped into the storytelling wrapper, right? It's all about what's happening inside your brain. I always say that the most important story you're going to hear at any given day is the one that you're telling yourself. Most of the time, though, we're not listening to their own stories, we're telling ourselves, and we don't understand that. How would you describe not just the importance of the internal dialogue, but what you're learning from a primal standpoint that's happening at the unconscious, or we'll call it the emotional empathic network versus the analytical network? What's happening from an internal dialogue storytelling for most people that they aren't even aware of, this superpower that exists there that's happening? Give us a little bit of color on your philosophy on the storytelling that's happening in the internal dialogue, where it's taking place, and then how to tap into that from a fan of your own storytelling, right? Inside your own head.
Yeah. So first of all, this is the thing that differentiates us from computers. Computers think in equations. Humans think in stories. Every single neuron in your brain is thinking in action. So that's why we call it action potentials, But basically, what your neurons exist to do is connect chains of actions together, and those chains of actions cash out in chains of behaviors. So as a human, you're doing this thing that a computer can never do, and every single neuron in your brain is doing that. And so what you want to start to do is you want to start to focus and combine those narratives. Because if you're having a lot of anxiety or your life is disorganized, what's happening is all these stories are just firing off in all these different directions, and you don't know which one of them to follow. And then a lot of times what then happens is you start saying, you know what, maybe other people have good advice for me. And then you start taking the stories from their brains and putting them into your brain. You've got even more stories going, right? And your head is just going in all these different directions. And what you actually have to do is you have to say, no, what is my one dominant story? And how do I start to take all of the other neurons in my brain and start to bring them behind that so I can tell this one story in a powerful direction so that I start to have real movement, because that's what you want in your life. And so you were talking earlier about this thing about communicating and why communicating is so important and how a lot of the work you do is with communicating. And I just came back from working with a group of special operators and their wives who are having challenges in their marriages. And, you know, one of the main challenges that we have in our relationships with other people is, first of all, we're not clear about our main need. So I talked with you before about how if you're a soldier on the battlefield, you need to know what your one main goal is. Like, what is my main goal? What is the hill that I'm trying to take right now? The same thing when you're in a relationship with somebody else is you need to tell them, here's the one thing you need to focus on with me. Like, here's the one thing that I really need. You know, do I need romance? Do I need emotional support? Do I need financial support? Like, what is the one thing that I need from you, right? And then vice versa, right? You know, what's the one thing you need from me? And in a communication environment, being really clear with people about what your story is, your main story, and then being really clear about their main story so you can come together and support each other. And then once you've got your main stories interlinked, you can take all of your minor stories and start to interlink those too. But you can't try, just like your mind can't try and do 11 things at the same time, right? Your relationship can't do 11 things at the same time, right? And if you're a boss talking with your employees, you can't have them do 11 things at the same time, right? They get confused. Right. And so being really clear in your own mind about what your major primary story is, communicating that to other people, helping them find their primary story, building those strong networks before going out into all of the minor stories and minor networks. So that's one of the main things that I encourage people to think about, because your brain evolved to do that. But in our modern environment, which is so full of distractions, it's unraveling. And you need to work harder than ever to find that narrative focus.
Too many data points coming in at one time.
Yes.
So is the relationship side of this, is it more about, now let's just get into like the love languages and different things where you're like, okay, this is my thing. This is my need this is my primary, the narrative of my primary need is X, and the narrative of my spouse's primary need is Y. And we understand those, then we can try to.
So if that works for you, that can work for you. I mean, different things work for different people. What I often say to people is I often use like, Maslow's hierarchy or anything like that. And I basically say, look, I mean, just be honest with yourself. What causes you huge domestic stress? Is it when there's not enough money in the bank? If that's the case, right, then the number one thing you want your partner to be doing is giving you that financial security. So when they do that, I want you to thank them for that and not get aggressive with them when they're not romantic when they come home, right? Or not get aggressive with them when they leave their dishes in the sink, right? Because, right, the foundation they're giving you is that economic support. Or maybe actually you're the kind of person that money's not that important, but your kids are really important.
Yeah.
And so you want your partner to make time for the kids. Really support them on that. Give them a break on the other stuff. Now, once you guys start to develop a really strong relationship based on that primary need, you can then start to work on the other things, right? So I'm not saying that, each relationship can only give you one thing, but I'm saying that each relationship has to build up that foundation from one thing to the next thing to the next. And it's like a story, when you're watching a story, you can't introduce 5 characters at the same time. Everybody gets confused.
Right.
You introduce one character, we know that character, then we introduce the next character, we know that character, and then we start to build. And so to your point, whether it's love languages or anything else, being really clear with your partner, here's my primary need, here's what I think I need, here's what I think you need, is that right? Let's work on that. Once we've got that solved, let's move on to the secondary need, and then the tertiary need, and so on and so forth. But let's not try and do too many things too fast.
Yeah, I bet that really gets amplified when you're working with military, right? Because they're trained in their environment professionally is such a different environment than the spouse, whose environment is completely different, as well as their training. I mean, there couldn't be probably too further. That's why there's probably so much conflict there.
Yeah, that's 100%. Also because, the way operators are, they work in these teams where they start to actually think like each other. And the reason they start to think like each other is they lock in on primary needs, then they move on to secondary needs, and they have this whole thing. And so then they come out of that environment where everyone is moving together, and they come home, and all of a sudden everything's not working the way that they want. And
Really
they get
disjointed.
Right. They're like, oh, something must be wrong. It's like, no, you've just got to build up the same thing you had in the team,
Yeah.
and you've got to take the time and build it. But because a lot of these guys are very intuitive at war, they don't realize that they were building it. And this is the same thing with a lot of people that are really successful. If you're successful at work, a lot of times you don't realize how you built it. And so then when you come home and you're bad at home, you think, oh my God, I can't do it. It's like, no. Just slow down your process at work, realize what you did there, and then apply the same thing at home, or vice versa. Slow down these brain processes, understand the steps. Every narrative is step by step by step by step. You can't read a novel and jump 3 pages and understand what's going on, right? That's the thing about a story, is you have to go step by step by step.
So let's pivot into communication a little bit more and I want to learn a little bit more about what you're really working on, you're excited about now, as well as any more depth on the book you want to talk about. But from a communication standpoint, back to the training piece, right? As under pressure, under stress, whether you're in a sales role today or whether you're a leader coaching someone, heck, you're just talking to somebody at home. You tend to communicate from your highest level of knowledge, experience, and programming, right? It's a reactive thing more than anything else. So if your programming isn't of the highest level of effectiveness, then that's what's going to come leaking out of your mouth in those moments of stress. And that's my belief anyway. And I think the research kind of shows that. What do we need to do then? I know we talked earlier about pre-training, right? Before you're in the situation. But in a lot of cases, you don't know how to plan for every scenario. When someone asks you this question, this comes out of left field. And where does that come from in our unconscious? How do you underscore, Jeff, this is right? This is what's happening from a habit standpoint. You're going to meet, when you do your thing with James, he talks a lot about atomic habits. And we think of literal incremental habits of things that are behavioral. I talk about it from a communication standpoint. We have the same programming in our communication habits that come out of our mouth under pressure. What are your thoughts on that, and how can we become better communicators by understanding that primal intelligence center of our brain?
Yeah, so I agree with everything you just said. As far as communicating, the two critical things are just giving people one goal. A lot of communication breakdowns because you try and ask people to do 2 things at the same time, or you ask them to do something today that contradicts what you asked them to do yesterday, and so they get confused, right? So really always focus on what is our primary goal here, and then explain to them why it matters. So, if you're sending your, spouse to the supermarket to buy bananas or something, say, well, the reason we need bananas is because our doctor told us that our kid needs some kind of mashed starch or something like that, right? Mashed starch. And then if they go to the store and there aren't bananas, they can pick up sweet potatoes because they know why. And that allows them to act autonomously. And so the key thing about communication is you are both being clear about what you want, but also giving the other person a little bit of latitude to do it their own way. Because if you just try and tell people exactly what to do, you're going to end up micromanaging them. You're going to take away their agency. They're going to burn out. And they're going to miss opportunities to actually surprise you by doing what you asked for better than you asked for it. So if you give them clarity over what the overall goal is and why it matters, and if you practice, as you said, doing that in low stress environments, just practice your communication on a daily basis with people when it's not stressful. Because if you only start to think about it consciously when it is stressful, you'll just fall back into bad habits. And bad habits are usually yelling, disorganized, micromanaging. So you're telling people to do too many things and you're being over precise in how they need to do them. And that's why practicing in a low stress environment is the key, that when high pressure hits, you can be clear about the goal and clear about why it matters.
So what I heard you say there is context. I always say this: context is king. If you're really good at communicating context to people, personally or professionally, it really helps creating an environment of understanding quicker. So here's a question for you. I don't know if you really studied this or not, because I'm not a linguistic expert, but I believe words matter. And I believe that words in a specific order many times matter because the way they can be interpreted by the brain can activate different brain regions, where you can ask a certain question like, well, why would you do that? Or I can ask a different question as, I'm curious, when you think about how many things were on your priority list and you chose number 2, I'm curious what led you to that decision. 2 completely different questions that were processed in completely different areas of the brain. So when it comes to being a great communicator, do you like to think of it in terms of that degree of specificity of, boy, you can get really good at understanding what areas of the brain to activate literally with words?
Yeah, well, you hit on one of the things that I learned from special operations, which is that why is what we always want to know from the other person. Like the number one thing we always want to know when someone does something is like, why did you do that? You know? But if you ask why, it almost always triggers a defensive reaction.
Right.
And they're like, or, they make a judgment or whatever. And so actually, I had this opportunity to kind of go through these special operations courses where they figure out how to get information out of people. And they never ask why. Instead, they ask who, what, when, where, how. And so if you focus on those questions, that's just like a simple thing. I'm sure your audience knows this already, but if they don't, if you focus on those questions, if you say to someone, where were you when you made that decision? What did you do 5 minutes before you made that decision? These kinds of questions, that puts them, to your point, in the context. They start to remember the context. They start thinking about the overall situation they were in. They shift focus off of themselves, which removes them from a defensive state into thinking about, okay, what were the forces that I was looking at? And then that explains to me why I did this. And then when you finally get to the why question, they're able to think about it holistically in terms of all the forces there. So I totally agree with you that certain questions like why, certain words like why immediately prompt the opposite of communication.
And what's great about that is, I know we could go geek out on this all day long on this now, but we train a lot of B2B professional sellers. And one of the things we teach them on with the art of communication is this idea of asking what we call neurocentric questions, like ordering the words in a way that activates the part of the brain that mitigates the defense mechanism. Well, whoever's taught salespeople how to do that? Nobody, right? Because they just learn to go do a needs analysis and say, well, what are your top 5 objectives? Well, situational context is really important, right? When you're communicating, if I already have, this is what I love about what your work is. If I already have in my brain, the primal intelligence is a planner, I'm already intuitively planning that you are probably not there to help me, you're there to hurt me. So I got a plan for how I'm going to respond to you in any given scenario, even if I'm doing it intuitively. And then you ask me what my top 5 things are. I'm assuming that you're asking me those things so you can gain information from me to give you an advantage to then tell me what I should do differently. Is that fair?
That's certainly right. Yeah. And to your point about sales, the whole key to sales is actually knowing the person better than they know themselves. That's when they start to trust you, is when you start to be able to anticipate things that help them. And they're like, oh my goodness, you're right. Helping me. That's what builds trust. And so if you ask someone, what are your top 3 priorities? Immediately they're like, well, you should know what my top 3 priorities is. Right. I mean, so you have to ask the questions that actually surface the things that they don't know about themselves. And a lot of that involves noticing what's unique or different about the person and valuing it. So, the problem that I find when I work with salespeople a lot of times is they want to come in with a formula for questions that's going to help this person. But effective salespeople always do the opposite. They listen deeply to the person. They surface things about the person that are unusual. Instead of saying to the person, oh, you remind me of all these other people, they're like, oh my goodness, that's interesting. Where did that come from? Or so on and so forth. And you start to build that sense of who they are as a person. That means you're learning their story. When you learn someone's story, you can guess the next chapter before they get there. And that's the key, I think, to successful sales is being that faster story thinker, being able to tell their story to them faster than they saw it. And a lot of times that might mean, hey, I realized I don't have the product to sell you, but you know who does? This other company. Right. Now I've just built trust by putting you in that direction. 2 months later when I call you up, we have that trust, and I do have something that you actually need, and you buy it immediately.
And isn't that the same true with relationships in general, with the human condition, right? I tell folks a lot, they don't always believe me. I said, what the stuff that we teach isn't to make you better at manipulating others, it's modulating. Like I need to modulate what's happening in your brain so that we can get somewhere further, faster together. Not because if you're trying to manipulate somebody, whether it's in sales or in life, you're going to be found out, right? The mirror neurons are going to activate, and there's always going to be some spidey senses that make me not want to go deeper or further with you. Do you believe that's true? Like the unconscious can really pick out that?
So this is another thing, and maybe this is perhaps my biggest communication tip. This is something I learned from the Green Berets. So what the Green Berets say is that you cannot detect authenticity in someone, but you can detect inauthenticity. And what that means is that you can detect when someone is being evasive. And so what happens in a conversation is if I start asking you questions or I start saying things and I can see that you're either avoiding what I'm saying, or you're trying to push me in another direction or something like that, then I can say, okay, this person's being inauthentic because they're not admitting something. So what the Green Berets always do before they go into any conversation is they write down a list of things they're afraid to share with the other person. They say, what are things that I'm afraid of sharing with the other person? And then they commit to sharing them if it comes up in conversation. And what that means is that you never act evasively when you're in those conversations. And you automatically say the thing. And then the person says, you know what? Maybe I don't like this person, but I trust them. And actually, trust is more important than liking. It's particularly right. in relationships. So that is something I firmly believe in. And I often work with salespeople and say, look, what are you afraid of sharing with that person? And it starts by acknowledging your own fears to yourself. Because a lot of times, you're putting pressure on yourself. I got to close the sale. I got to do this. I got to do these other things. Put that down on a piece of paper, admit that to yourself, make peace with that, then put it away, right? It's not going to bother you anymore. Now you admit it. Then think, what am I afraid of this person saying? Maybe this person's going to tell me something about this wrong with my product that I know is wrong with my product. Admit it. If I'm like, yeah, that is a problem with the product. But, there's this other thing, And the more you can develop that, I'm not being evasive. You're not only not manipulating people, you're actually being very candid. You're building real trust, and you will go home and you will sleep well at night because you are knowing that you're doing the best for that other person. And the effective salespeople that I've seen are always interested in helping other people by giving them the thing that they need in their lives to make it better, as opposed to a short-term thing where I give you something that's a piece of junk and then I have to hide from you for the rest of my life.
Now I'm going to go nerd out on this because I haven't done the study on this. I bet you guys could do this, but if you do the tip that Angus just gave, what happens in the brain? You hold me accountable to this. If I don't do those things and they come up in conversation, it's going to activate probably adrenaline and cortisol, which is going to cause me to be in a different frame of mind, which is going to cause me to communicate inauthentically, which is going to activate from emotional contagions, the same in you. But if I do that ahead of time and then it comes up, I'm probably going to get some dopamine because I recognize that I get rewarded for being prepared and I didn't come across completely authentic in the moment. Is that true? Would you say that's validatable in neuroscience world?
That is very validatable, and that is true. That is already 100% true. So yes, absolutely. If you are in a situation where you're trying to avoid things, of course that's raising your stress. Of course that's raising your cortisol. If you're in a situation where you're actually able to be authentic with someone, that's gonna build things like oxytocin. That's actually gonna build bonding chemicals in your brain, and you're gonna feel closer to that person. They're gonna feel closer to you.
And if you avoid it, you don't realize if you don't do these things, you don't realize that when you get in the moment, again, under pressure, you didn't prepare for it. So you're going to have the wrong neurochemistry and the wrong whole approach, all that. Okay. Anyway. So see there, everyone listening, I'm not a complete moron. Like I know some of the stuff that I talk about sometimes because, I bring on guys like Angus no, I'm kidding. Tell us a little bit more about what led to you wanting to write Primal Intelligence. Because, coming off your previous work, that was a wonderful book. So much of that, but what was the gap then that was still left that you wanted to go deeper with Primal Intelligence?
Well, it all started really when I was contacted by U.S. Army Special Operations, so I do have to give them credit. And they said, look, Angus, your expertise is how you tell these stories to yourself that shift your brain's performance. We want to figure out the stories that we can tell in these kinds of fight or flight combat situations that improve our performance. And we think that maybe you can help us a little bit here. And so that's how I started working with them. And over the course of that research, that's when we developed this framework of intuition, imagination, emotion, and common sense, and how to train up those different parts of your brain to make these plans in these situations. And after I was done with that training, I asked them, I said, hey, is this classified, or can I take this and share this with the kids in my school district? And can I take this and share this with high schoolers and college students? And they said, of course, go take it. And they actually awarded my medal my lab a medal for this research, which we have proudly on the wall. And so the Army has kind of given us the blessing to share this training with everybody. And so that's really why I wrote the book. I wrote the book as a way of both being a thank you to the Army and also to kind of say to people, look, a lot of these things you're struggling with, there are answers to them. It's relatively straightforward. And a lot of it just comes back to, as I know you teach, Jeff, just getting in touch with your brain's basic neurochemistry and using the power that you already have inside.
That's amazing. I love it. I love every bit of it. So part of your secret is like, well, it would be cool if it was, classified, because it was so good it was classified, but it's so good they didn't want it to be classified, right? They wanted it to be out there. in the world. So where can folks go to learn a little bit more? I know you had some, as in the pre-launch phase, you've got some assessments we can take, we can learn, and we can get ready for the book to launch. And where can we go to learn more?
Yeah, so the book will come out in August. It's called Primal Intelligence. It's from Penguin Random House. We'll have a big event, as you mentioned, with James Clear in Columbus, and we'll do Malcolm Gladwell at the Y in New York, if anyone happens to be there. And we'll also be doing some events in San Francisco with Google and some other people. As far as if you want to take a diagnostic, we have a free diagnostic at our site, which is operationhuman.com, operationhuman.com. And you can also, if you go to my site on LinkedIn, if you go to Angus Fletcher on LinkedIn, it'll link you to Operation Human. And I do want to say to your audience that as much as I want you to buy the book, and of course I would love it if you buy the book, I want to emphasize to all of you that this is stuff you already have inside. This is knowledge that you already have inside. So if you're already accessing your brain, you don't need the book. Just take what you're already doing and spread it through your community.
I appreciate your humility, but I'm going to go and trump that to the audience and say, you think you're doing it right. You're probably not. Buy the book, because he's going to teach you how to do it better. I'm going to buy the book. I teach this stuff every day, and I'm always learning from experts like Angus more and more. If you find anyone who says they understand the brain completely, 100%, and there's no room for improvement, you should run, because they do not. But there are certainly people that are miles ahead of everyone else, and you are one of those people. And we look up to you and what you're doing, and we really appreciate it, because it's making all of us better. So thanks again for being on.
Thank you, Jeff. Anytime.